Cool and good. Yeah, but we maybe need a bit of air. What do people think? It's
have no air, not get this.
You'd rather have no air. Okay. Okay. Hello, Adela. Good to see you. Good to see you. You did come in. Yeah, yeah, Ryan. Perhaps if anyone passes out, we can open the window. What's that? No, right. Yeah, I'm recording it now. Can we have silence to focus our minds a bit on the... Cornelius, please, can we just about to start, so we can have silence, thanks. Helt kvällskvällsinne på något nytt. Då är det maken lite att se ni och ge det sitt från den sitt. Randa att Randy Brennans kunnin funnit vilket för funnat mother of money att man kunde inte after. A man from another man may become wiser, but from conceit may remain ignorant. Truth, like the sky, is above and beyond us all. Blessed God, that our peoples and lands may we spend this time together in friendship with you and with each other, and use it to come good. Tonight's subject, whose bare name seems somewhat underdressed without the nobiliary honorific of Baron, whatever its legitimacy, was a man exceptionally well read and wide-ranging in his thought, and indeed productive of works. The two things he seemed to be searching for in his life were tradition and transcendence. When he was 23, he was saved from suicide, he says, by a Buddhist text that enjoined the shedding of every part of one's identity except that part which was transcendent. Whatever the dispensation under which Julius Evola died, which Father Frank might say something about, he did not seem to find a comfortable place in a home in any traditional community of faith, or to begin to establish one that might fill the European vacuum. Throughout his later works, to my ears, the dominant strain is a certain unhappiness, that's of the sadness of a man who wished to be a believer, but whose heart was only rarely touched by divine grace. The quote from Salvador Dali comes to mind: "I know that God exists, but I don't believe it." The greater part of what he approved of is described in very abstract language, and the greater part of what he disapproved of, which seems to occupy most of the works that I'm familiar with, are the specific statements of other people and the concrete details of contemporary life. So I'm curious to know how he lived. But maybe the main point of his Ride the Tiger is that it's to free oneself of any responsibility to lead life as one thinks one should, if one finds oneself born in times when it's very difficult to do that. The important thing about traditional values is not that they are traditional. They become traditional because they seem to work. They seem inherently appropriate, seem to correspond with human need and a divine will at a deep level, and in such a way to be in accordance with nature. And because of this, they lead to health and happiness. They are thus empirically identifiable, not arbitrary and disassociated experience. And there's something selfless about tradition, about pouring one's individuality into a form not of one's own creation. But life is inalienably about renunciation, because of all the infinite lives that one could have led in one's present body, every single one of them will be renounced, except the one that one does live. The two things that this great thinker and troubled soul, I think, sought in his life are essentially related. Tradition is disclosed by the transcendent, and for almost everyone, tradition helps us to find transcendence in our lives, which is the greatest of blessings, which is why Julius Evola is important. And with that, I very warmly invite Father Frank to address us. Thank you.
In Ecce Homo, his very sort of personal autobiography, Nietzsche says at some stage, "I'm not a man, I'm dynamite." Well, Julius Evola might have said the same of himself, although I don't remember him saying it. Before him, you had the feeling you were in front of someone who was a true aristocrat. Aristocrat in the etymological sense. Aristocracy is the rule of the best, and we are talking about aristocracy of character. I know he was a baron, but that's not essential. His aristocracy was one of character, and he was a dominating, unique spirit. Now, what I'm going to do tonight, I'm going to talk a bit how I got to know him. Then I will talk a bit about his ideas, which some of you will be familiar with already. And then Lenin's question, what is to be done? Namely, to what extent is Evola helpful in fighting the battle some of us want to fight, if at all? So, how did I get to know him? I talk about my conversation with him in this book, which I had not actually self-printed. I mean, Amazon, and Stead asked me to get a copy so I could show it around. I had not actually reread it since I wrote it. You know, like many people who write books and things, I don't reread it. But I reread it before tonight, and you know, I know it sounds a little bit self-advertising, but it's jolly good, actually. But, so, let's do a little bit of time machine. So, go back to the Rome. Rome was my birthplace, where I was brought up, on my youth. So you can imagine, a few years ago. And I was a member of a cultural group, or young men. We had a few women, it was mostly young men, called Il Solstizio, the solstice, in Rome. And we were all interested in esoterical traditionalist ideas. And Julius Evola especially was our guru, so to speak. The prime mover of the group was a young man called Adriano Romualdi, who was actually the son of let's say far right expression, I hate the expression, let's use it, MP, Pino Romualdi, the MSI, the movement for social Italian movement. And Pino Romualdi was rumored to be the legitimate son of Mussolini. He even looked slightly like the Duce. So Adriano would have been the grandson of the Duce, but Adriano, to be fair, never mentioned that, but some of us would snigger about behind his back. He was a highly intellectual person. He wrote a book about Evola. And on one occasion, Adriano and some of us went to see Evola in his apartment in central Rome. Now, you knocked on the door, some ancient, well, actually not ancient, but I mean from my perspective now, but some old governess or housekeeper opened the door. She was German, and actually Evola spoke German to her. She shuffled us in, And he was, of course, seated, he was paralyzed when he went down because of a bombing which had taken place in Vienna in 1945. He was on a wheelchair, and that was in his study, but the apartment itself was decorated, wherever there was an empty space, with paintings of his early days, Dadaist paintings. He'd been a Dada painter. They were actually copies, which only learned later, because he had actually either given some of the original paintings to a museum or sold some. So he had painted copies of them. I must say, at the time, I could have no appreciation of Dadaism. They were totally meaningless. I know that State would have been quite appreciative. So we sat around, and I was mesmerized by him in many ways, the awe. But in a way it was frustrating because he seemed to pay no attention at all to me. Some of us, after he spoke, asked questions, but I was totally ignored. I think I stammered a question, but my impression was he just cracked down and he dismissed me out of the hand. So I left the meeting feeling somewhat depressed. But then Adriano, General Moldi, he phoned me up and says, "Evola would like to see you again." I was taken aback. So we went to Adriano to see Evola, and there sort of, it was different. I felt we communicated. And then Adriano let me know, the band would like to see you. I said, "You're coming as well?" He said, "No, just you." So that began a series of conversations which I had with Julius Evola in his apartment over the years. But he asked me never to talk about it, never to tell people about it. But Adriano Moldi got wind of it, and he was very, very envious. And he spread all sorts of rumors about me. Well, there you are. He died young in a car crash in circumstances rather ludicrous, and I talked about it in the book, incidentally. Shame, because he had a good mind. So we had, over years, we met sometimes every week, sometimes every month. There's conversations which I, as I say, related here. Now, I have to say, I didn't take any notes at the time. We're talking about, 45 years ago. So this book is partly an interpretation. And I will tell later what my interpretation was, which is based on one of his key categories, the distinction between esoterical and exoterical. So my interpretation is an esoterical interpretation of what Evola. Actually, people refer to him as a baron at times, but I tended to call him professore, because Italy is a culture where academic titles were very important, still are very important. So to call someone professore, it's higher than calling someone conte or marquis or baron or whatever. So I refer to him as professor. Right. So now let me move to some of his ideas. His chief work is a revolt against the modern world, which many of you would be familiar with. And here the key categories are revolt against modernity from the point of view of tradition. Now, what does Evola mean by tradition? And incidentally, in one of his articles somewhere, he spoke of different traditions which one can choose. There are different traditions, not just one. But his traditional capital T. Basically, there is a critique of modern cultural civilization from the standpoint, again, of tradition. His methodology was to look at modern culture from the point of view of a set of myths, of sagas, of legends, which are dismissed by historians, by critics, often as merely of historical or minor interest. But Evola's methodology was the opposite. In order to understand many of the ideology, modern ideology, you have to plug into the world of tradition, into these myths, into his legends, into his sagas, which really bring us closer to truth. One of his, talk about that, was the myth of Grail, which is one of my favorite books about Evola, which, of course, we live in the country where we have places like King Tadro, like Carleon, where sites where the Grail is supposed to have played a role, so there is a certain. Now, Evola spoke no English and didn't have any knowledge really of Anglo-Saxon culture, apart from very dismissive terms. But he loved the doctrine of the Grail. So there are these truths, sagas, myths, legends, which gives us an insight of what really we ought to understand about modernity. And in a way, it's a reversal of the usual paradigm. We think, or many of us, think of history as progressive. We are moving away from superstition, from darkness, from ignorance, towards the light. That is exemplified in some of the revolutions of the modern world, especially the French Revolution, which is one of the things which made Evola angry was the French Revolution is preceded by the so-called Enlightenment, or the French call le siècle des Lumières, the century of lights. Evola really sort of hated that because here Enlightenment is completely, again, it's inversion. One of its categories, inversion of values. Enlightenment is not the original meaning, which is a light from above, if you like, but it is based on the notion of a rationalistic and almost, I'm using the word very carefully, the demonic nature. Evola spoke of demonic in connection especially with demonic of economics. And he took the word from Werner Sombart, the German economist who spoke of the demonic aspect of economy. You know, sorry, listen, it sounds like a digression, but after Vatican II, I went to a meeting held by progressive Catholics, and I made my point, and he looked at me if I was a madman. And they said, this question, 3 concilia, is before the council. Sort of, but in a way, in hindsight, it said a lot. So we have here an inversion of values. And of course, the last chapter, or Revolt against the modern world, is the cycle closes. So the cycle of degeneration, of decadence, closes at the end of Revolt against the modern world by a critique of Bolshevism and Americanism, which Evola really equated. Now, one thing I want to mention is that, I'm going to talk about it later, but because I'm talking about a group, Evola also had a reputation in some circles as a bit of an occultist. He hated that. And like René Guénon was also, didn't like the notion of being an occultist. But amongst us, for some reason, we formed the notion that we ought to mention his name with some awe. We do not mention Evola's name in vain. So I remember once I done that, and I walked out of where I was, very near Via Nazionale, which is a big avenue in central Rome. And I was going to go under a bus. A bus was about to run me over. So I said, oh, here we are. I mean, I should not have mentioned the professor, the name of the professor. I mentioned this just the passage. Although I'm not, and everyone was claimed to have any particular powers, but actually, it all depends what you mean by occultist. And I think I shall try to say more about that. One episode, now, Evola was actually summoned by Mussolini once to Palazzo Venezia, which is where the Duce lived and where his workplace was. Mussolini read one of his books, Synthesis of Doctrine of Race. Now, this word race, again, you have to be very careful. It doesn't mean biological race. For Evola, there is a race of the body, the race of the soul, a race of the spirit. And there are different categories. Now, he wrote this book. And at the time, Mussolini was in September 1941. He was in alliance with Hitler's Germany. And he was trying to find a version of theory of race, which was genuinely Italian, not merely a copy from the Germans. And in fact, he said to Evola, this is the book which we need. But then Mussolini dropped Evola. Why? Well, Evola talks about it in his book, The Silver Path, which is a kind of bookish autobiography. I mean, one of the features of fascism was nationalism, which is actually in continuation with the Risorgimento, with the First World War, and so on. And you cannot have appeal to nationalism if you start dividing the nation. So the Italians are not a nation. No modern nation is a nation in the racial sense, but I think the English are more of a race than the Italians, who really do have components which are saying no way could be categorized as Aryan or, I think you know what I mean. So for that reason, Mussolini dropped him. But maybe that did not actually help the Duce, because for other reasons, like basically military alliance with the Hitler Germany was at capacity. For practical reasons, actually, because Italy did not have the kind of preparation, did not have the kind of resources, was not an industrial nation, it didn't have an army. That's sort of beside the point. So, what's my next point? Yeah, I mean, one of the, it's interesting that State earlier on was referring to, he thought of Evola as a troubled personality, someone who did not find a specific anchoring. Well, I disagree with that. But certainly that coheres with a guy called Enzo Erra, who was not a member of the Solstizio, because slightly older, but into Evola. And Enzo Erra, whom I knew, I didn't think much. He thought he was, I don't know if any of you know in Italian, stronzetto, a little turd. But maybe that's a slight too strong. But, anyway, he wrote The Mystery of Evola. There was a mystery about Evola. And he thought the mystery was actually not so much his personality, but the doctrine of 4 ages, which mirrors the age of gold, the age of silver, the age of bronze, and the age of iron as a constant decay. Final age of disintegration with darkness.
Non, ça va.
Lower age of the age.
Tu sais, c'est quand tu étais chez moi un jour, j'avais une conférence tard le soir en anglais, le même club.
But Erra pointed out something which actually was valuable. Now, how is it? What is the mechanism which, from the age of gold, which is an age of harmony, or dignity, of even physical characteristics like decrepitude, old age, do not obtain, to all of that, to a decay. Of course, the age of golden age is the age of the Brahmins, the age of the sacerdotes, priests, not priests in the modern sense of Church of England, priests in some sacred sense, and then to the warriors. Now, Evola certainly thought of himself as a kshatriya, as a warrior. And that's one of the reasons I think he didn't like the priests. But what caused this decline? Well, I mean, you might as well ask the question, why Eden from paradise degenerated. Well, I mean, in the book of Genesis there is a serpent which causes the trouble, but I mean, then the question, why was that there? But that's only an analogy. But Enzo Erra, in my opinion, raised a legitimate question. Why this process of decay from a golden age? Now, an answer, a kind of answer, was given by a man called Massimo Scaligero, who was another Italian traditionalist. He was a follower of Rudolf Steiner, or anthroposophy. Now, Evola didn't think of anthroposophy, did not have any appreciation of anthroposophy. He thought it was a reformation of theosophy, and he thought it was basically Illuministic, but it was actually appreciated Christianity too much, so he didn't care for Rudolf Steiner at all. But I think to give the devil his due, Scaligero makes the point that maybe we should not think of the process of a fall from the golden age to the age of iron as something which, in a way, is like a struggle. And in the final age, it is up to us, or say us, those who want to identify themselves, to fight and to recreate some kind of new, a new dignity, a new state of affairs. And actually, Evola, in a sense, at times seemed to contradict himself, because although at times he wrote or spoke as if a Kali Yuga was just inevitable and we had to wait for the next cosmic age, in other areas, for example, in the book Men in the Ruins, actually I've got a copy there, which in Italian, which I don't have a copy, which autographed copy ever gave me anymore. I mean, I just many of my books I don't down the drain. But in that book, he sets out like a breviary. You know, Catholic Church, a breviary is a formulary of prayers. It's a breviary of how to behave in the age of dissolution. But that implies that it isn't sort of deterministic. It is inevitable. There are things you can do. And Men of the Ruins is actually a preface by Prince Giulio Valerio Borghese, who was an Italian aristocrat who during the Second World War had commanded a famous team of naval commanders, the Decima Mas. And he was the real Macaulay, in a sense. He was the real warrior, real Kshatriya. Even the Brit acknowledged that his value, so to speak. And the book, Men in the Ruins, is really an assertion of the supremacy of a state, the importance of a state, the imperial, whichever I call the imperial. It's another word which has to be qualified. Imperial not just as an empire, because, you know, take the British Empire, was a commercial empire, was built on commercial economic values. There was very little really of traditional value. But it's imperium in the sense of a dominion which relates to the values of the spirit, higher value. That is the sense of imperium, which is you can find in the Holy Roman Empire of German nation of the age and so on. So in a way, that book, and which has interesting chapters like occult war, there is an occult war, and which was the title actually more or less of a book which was distributed during Vatican II by a traditionalist group to the Conciliar Fathers, Conspiracy Against the Church, which was a very interesting book at the time. It didn't actually invert the direction of the church was going, but certainly it was a valuable book. Now, I've spoken about that. I want to say, the quest of a Holy Grail. Everyone, I believe, dismissed completely the notion of the Holy Grail as a Christian element. He really had an animus against Christianity. He made a distinction between Christianity and Catholicism, but even Catholicism he wasn't really very keen on. Some aspects of medieval Catholicism he appreciated. He also says in his, he told me as well, but he also mentioned in his Cinema Path how as a young man he spent some time in a Catholic contemplative monastery. Can't remember, it was a Carthusian, so whatever. And he felt he really focused, there was no real emphasis on the transcendent. It was just a mechanical recitation of formula prayers. He was not impressed and dismissed. But he certainly thought Catholicism had elements which could be valuable from a point of view of tradition, asceticism, the notion of an order, religious order, discipline, and so on, but very limited, to a limited extent, and the arrival of Vatican II completely destroyed whichever positive aspect, appreciation he had. But coming back to the Grail, he says, to appreciate, to win the Grail, you approach the Grail with weapons in hand. Weapons in hand. Again, the notion is that the quest of the Holy Grail is a quest conducted, it's a chivalrous quest, a warrior quest, conducted by a warrior. He didn't like Nietzsche, he didn't care at all for Wagner's Parsifal. He thought of Parsifal as a betrayal of spiritual Grail. Actually, I must admit, I quite like the Parsifal, Wagner's Parsifal. Sometimes I thought of myself a little bit like Parsifal. No, I shouldn't say that, I think Evola would not really appreciate that. So there is a quest of a Holy Grail. Wolfram von Eschenbach, who wrote a book of the Grail, said the Grail is such, it can only be approached by the initiated. By initiated, Eschenbach meant the baptized. Now, Evola would have no truck with that. He said that here, waters don't mean the waters of baptism, but the waters of enlightenment. So it's completely dismissed theology. And I can't help feeling, whenever I went to Tintagel and to Calia, if Evola had been around, he would have liked it. There's no question that he really had an animus against Christianity. Why? Well, I mean, Christianity, the values of the gospel are not values which Evola could have shared. Turn the other cheek, meekness. I mean, I think there is a travesty of Jesus' personality. Gentle Jesus, meek in mind. That is not the Jesus of all the Gospels. I mean, there is someone who fights against demons and so on. But at the same time, there is no way in which you can really whitewash Christianity and make it fit into the Evola mold. Now, coming back to my book, which as I said is really good. One thing I should mention, sometimes I felt as if Evola regarded me as a son. They sound very presumptuous. He didn't have a son, I never had a son, but he told me that on one occasion he had a letter from a German woman whom he met in Germany, who later migrated to Argentina, like many Germans, and who wrote to him and said, look, I have given birth to a son. It is your son. I think it's your son. And Evola was not the guy to get sentimental about children. But there was an element of, there was a wistfulness, a melancholy when he said that, which led me to feel that maybe that it was not really, he didn't say that he tried to attract it. So if he really did have somebody, someone in Argentina, wandering around the Pampas or in Buenos Aires, who really is the descendant. But I felt at times I could have been, but that was a presumptuous of me to feel that way. I think I wasn't really. Now, okay, so now, the thesis of my book. Now, I am aware that many quarters he had a very dark reputation. I'm surprised not tonight we've not had the usual suspects who disrupt our meeting. We were.
Just keep going.
But now it's silly young. We don't know. Well, it injects an element of excitement. But so, with dark figure, I try to, my thesis, because there are many references to Islam in Evola's writings. They're usually appreciative. I mean, you dislike Christianity for being a proselytizing religion or so, but Islam is a proselytizing religion, just as well. He especially valued Ismaili Islam, the Ismaili tradition of Islam, which is an esoterical tradition. The old man of the mountain, of whom Marco Polo speaks in his writings. It's an esoterical doctrine. Now, that in Marco Polo, that is made out in a slightly sort of fantastic way that these guys have been, the assassins, assassins, have been drugged, went out, and then they woke up again in a pseudo-garden of delights, and he made them believe that they experienced paradise. I think that is a somewhat superficial view, but certainly there is something about this esoterical element. So, when I was in Turkey, I was in a chaplain in Turkey for 2 years. I was at a British embassy, an Italian or British embassy or chaplain. I was an English of tolerant. And so I got to know quite a few Sufis there. One of the Sufi groups which I found most intriguing was a group called Malamatiya. These are Sufis who cultivate a path to God, a path to transcendence, via shame. They cultivate shameful actions, shameful deeds. One, maybe the most famous example is of the Sufi of Baghdad, Al-Hallaj, about whom the great French Orientalist Massignon wrote a book, La Passion d'Al-Hallaj, The Passion of Al-Hallaj. He suffered appalling death tortured and crucified, because at some stage he said, Ana al-Haq, Ana al-Haq. Now, Ana al-Haq in Arabic means I am the truth, but it means more than the truth, I am God, because al-Haq ultimately means God. So that is ultimate blasphemy, and it was, now, why did he say that? In fact, other Sufis have said something similar. They have not suffered as much as al-Hallaj, but there was politics involved. But that would be an example that al-Hallaj was seeking a martyr in order to achieve a union with God by wavering from, by claiming to be God, going close to God. But more humdrum examples. A friend of mine was telling me, a Sufi in North Africa, who told his disciple, go and have sex with a whore. Now, this is not what in Islam usually do that. But that would have been an example of Malamatia, the way of shape. So, now this may not please you, and that's a reason why nobody wanted to publish the book officially, claiming that Evola was Malamatia Sufi. In fact, it's called the Sufi of Rome, the Sufi of Rome. Now, in my conversations, there were several references to Sufis, all positive, and on one occasion, in fact, indirectly to the Malamatia. Indirectly, not. I don't think he mentioned it. So, in a way, I might make out a case that maybe deliberately, sometimes he deliberately quoted shame and appropriate in order to, not to draw closer to God, because he didn't really believe in God in any monotheistic sense, drawing closer to a transcendent. It's a thesis. I'm not claiming it's necessarily correct, but it's, I felt that nobody had done that before, so I wanted to make that point, make that. And I should say, this book is only a selection. There were other examples of conversation. One example, which I mentioned in another book, which I finished now, but I'm not really uploaded yet. On one occasion, I was visiting him, and was this kind of, let's call him a Sufi guy, immensely tall. I'm a very tall guy, but he was taller than me. And he looked very old. His name was Mustafa. And we talked about jinns, his spirits. And Islam. And I sort of, everyone didn't say anything. But I was, because at the time was on the whole, I was under the influence of left-wing ideas, and so I felt myself progressing in many ways. So that is bullshit. And he said, well, why don't you come with me tonight to the Colosseum, and we'll have a ceremony of jinns. Now, I said, it's crap, surely. But Evola said, well, why don't you go? I mean, it was an empirical test. So I did go, and he wanted me to go with a virgin. Now, I had many girlfriends, well, a few girlfriends, but they were not very. So I said to myself, well, would a male virgin do? And I said, and he said yes. And I had a friend who was a young man called Francesco, younger than me, whom he was very much anti, he was only 18, but he didn't like the idea of sex. I knew even Francesco the Virgin. He came with me, incidentally, Francesco later on, I introduced him to Evola. The influence was not positive. Francesco became very obsessed. And later on, after I left Italy, I was period there, Francesco had a terrible death, a terrible case. He was kidnapped by, anyway, he was murdered. But anyway, I don't want to talk too much about that. Oh yes, I forgot, I should mention Tantra, but that's after this. So we went to the Colosseum, and there was, it was night. In those days, you could enter the Colosseum quite naturally. Today, if you go to Rome to try to enter the Colosseum, you have to pay a ticket. You can't sort of walk in, but that was a long time ago. Colosseum was a place of prostitutes of both sexes, and but anyway, I went along with Francesco. I said to Mustafa, how do we find you? Colosseum is big. But for some reason, we met him straight away. And there was, let's call it a kind of seance, or ceremony of jinns. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about it, but certainly there was something there. You have to wait until that book comes out if you want to know the conclusion of it. Now, the thing about Tantra, because that relates to that book, The Metaphysics of Sex, which again is it is one of my favorite books by Evola. It's a really interesting book. It's a very misleading title because sex, we all know where sex conjures up. It is not sex in the mundane, prosaic, biological sense. No, it's more like eros in a transcendental sense. An example would be, that does not exclude sex anymore. There was, Evola told me about the tantric tradition. He's written about it. Now, I was, say, young and impressionable, and I said, well, I got to do this. So he would not support me, but there was a yoga academy in central Rome, and I knew a guy, an Indian guy who ran it, a man called Satish. And I said, Satish, can you teach me to do some tantric exercise? He said, yes, you need a partner. I said, okay, all right. I had a girlfriend called Liana, who was quite open to it, and so we did those tantric experiences. Now, what shall I say? Because the idea of tantric is supposed to elevate you from the level of mere biological sex to a higher level of eros. Was that my experience? To some extent, it was a mixed experience. Unfortunately, Liana was not helped. She became very disturbed by it. But when eventually I mentioned to Evola, he was angry as hell. And I thought I was going to tell him, bugger off, never come back. But he didn't, but he was not pleased, that's for sure. So that's an example of his, the esoteric is the fundamental thing. Now, how are we for time?
It's about 45 minutes.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think actually I've said most of what I wanted to say. I think it would be good to have a short break and then Q&A.
Yeah, so, I mean, do you have much more to
No,
say?
not really, no, because it is...
Oh, okay. I mean, I very much hope and expect that there'll be a lot of people with questions to ask. So, well, thanks very much, Father Frank, for your very wide-ranging and stimulating account of your encounters with Julius Evola. I'm going to take questions alternately, I think, from online and in the room. Do people want to have a quick 5-minute break or not? Just one person. Who I think there doesn't seem to be a strong consensus about it. So let's press on. Anyone in the room who's got a question to ask? And people online as well, perhaps if you can be thinking.
2 questions.
Oh, you've got 2 questions.
Well, with the first question.
Oh, well. Sorry, what's your name, sir?
Joel.
Joel, okay, yeah,
Nice
please.
to meet you. Thanks.
Please go ahead.
So, I've got another question, but I'll ask maybe later. I'll let someone who ask another question. My first question is on what you just said. You said Evola was kind of upset with you for engaging in tantric practice. I'm curious, what was his problem? Like, what was his central objection to your experimentation?
Well, I mean, he actually believed that tantric exercises were dangerous, that they were not for all. It was only for, and he does mention he is having undergone tantric practices somewhere, I think, but again, I think if I remember correctly, but no, I mean, he felt that they were not for he might have felt I was not the right personality. At some stage, I remember, just actually, I went to see him shortly before I came to England, in 73. He died in 74. He was physically already very decayed, I could see it. And he said to me at some stage, "You're not a revolutionary." So I tried to joke, "Oh, I'm a counter-revolutionary." So that's much more difficult than being a revolutionary. And I was a little bit worried about what I was letting myself into. He said, "Well, you're young, you can sleep under the bridges, you can sleep in the street, I mean, it's not a problem. You can, don't worry about, so in a way, he quite backed me up in the idea of launching myself, because I didn't have any money. I came over, did a few jobs and so on. But anyway, but coming back to your question, the question was, he didn't think country exercises were for all, and probably felt I was a little bit fragile.
I'd like to ask a question, if I may. As someone whose maybe principal quest was for tradition, why didn't he feel at home in any of the existing traditional sort of faith communities, which many other people who are attracted by tradition do?
Well, certainly he could not have become a Christian or Catholic when he came. No way. That was ruled out. Buddhism, he wrote about Buddhism, but I think at the end of the day, he, in a way, felt it was his own tradition.
No.
He didn't have to join a group in that sense. And he had enough original teachings to feel that he already sort of had all he wanted. He didn't have to join anything.
So it wasn't that he really did have a yearning for tradition which just didn't exist at the time. He was maybe someone who was his own man in some sense, who maybe...
Well, I mean, his own approach, which is set out in his books, is partly, some people accuse him of having plagiarized Guénon, of course, which is not fair. Again, there are echoes of his traditional conception of history, the Four Ages, the decline, the critique of modernity in other writers, that in his case is set out in an exemplary way in Revolt against the modern world, which still, I've got in Italian, I never read it in English. He wasn't maybe the greatest master of language. Then in a way I'm thinking of Kant. Kant was an immensely deep philosopher, but as a writer he's very stodgy. As a speaker, I'm told that Kant was fascinating. So I found the Evola speech conversation absolutely riveting, but his books are distorted. In Italian, in English probably they get.
I want to lead into that state because it feels to me that Evola just didn't fit in. He was at the wrong place, the wrong time. And it's almost as if he didn't get in touch with his soul properly because he was touching here and there. And he obviously had some kind of master complex because he wanted to be that he was not, you know. And we incarnate and reincarnate into this world to learn and to give. And clearly he wanted to give, but it seems to me that he was all over the place because if you are that serious about your right-wing thinking, but also that in touch with some of the Sufi and other ideas, where does it fit in? Nowhere.
Well, Krista, I appreciate your comment. I have to say, the Sufi thing is my interpretation.
Okay.
Although he said it was interesting in the Sufis, insofar as they were an initiatic organization, and initiation is one of the chief categories. I can't see it as someone who was looking for no, I think he was very grounded in himself. What did I want to say? I left out actually, because I said at the beginning, I was going to say, you know, what is to be done? You know, Lenin wrote a pamphlet, what is to be done. I know it's funny, Ming, Lenin and Evola, but in a way, they're both masters of subversion, or different kind. So what is to be done, by which I meant what can be teaching the value of Evola for today, for people such as us. I don't know if I include myself with you, because I'm very much an oddball myself. But I would say he presents a unique teaching of rebellion. His books offer a radical dismantling, demolition of the myths of our time, of modernity. Equality is one. Sky is the limit. No, I take the tube a lot. I don't have a car. Whenever I take the tube, I look at the ads. It's quite clear we are in the Kali Yuga. What else? That is the Kali Yuga. What else? And it got worse. It got worse in the last few weeks. So that in Evola's writings there is this providing a set of ideas of visions how to oppose that kind of pestilent ideology which tries to suffocate, absorb, is a very good Italian word. I can't remember it now. There is something to do with absorption. So I think Evola in that sense is an invaluable master. You don't have to underwrite everything he says, no, but certainly. Yeah.
I'm going to try to get a question from one of our online. Richard, are you there, please? Richard Mason? I know we've got a couple of Richards.
Hello,
Richard,
can you hear me? Yes, I'm here.
Great.
Great. Thank you very much for the talk, Frank. And I just wanted to ask whether Julius Evola had any contacts with another Italian intellectual by the name of Anthony Ludovici, and his book, I think it was called Religion for Infidels, published in 1961, I felt had some semblance to Men Amongst the Ruins. And I've got other questions as well, but I don't want to hog the floor. Thank you very much for your talk.
Well, I mean, straight off, the name Ludovici is new to me, but there are many references to different writers in Evola's works. Some I remember quite well. But this name is, I can't put my finger on it. Maybe it doesn't mean that he doesn't mention it somewhere, but I can't know. So the answer is I don't know.
Richard, do you have any? What's the best other question you have, please?
Of course. The other question I have is what relationship or interaction did Julius Evola have with the French perennialist and fellow Muslim René Guénon? The second question as well is, as an arts traditionalist and a Sicilian baron, why didn't Evola have a family and leave a legacy? I may be incorrect, but believe Evola died without heirs. That concludes my questions, and thank you very much.
Correct. Of course, you never get Evola to discuss or talk about his past. His family, they just would not talk about it. Just shut it out completely. So that is a blank page. Coming back to the question of Guénon, there is much. Now, it isn't quite clear to me whether he actually met, I can't remember exactly if he actually met physically Guénon someplace. Well, Evola was in Paris, but certainly he knew his books, they corresponded a lot. And there is a great deal of Guénon converted to Islam, a form of Sufi Islam, went to live in Cairo. If you know anything about Cairo, it is not a comfortable place for a Westerner. He married into a family, Egyptian family, died in a Cairo hospital, which again, not ideal places. And when I mention Sufism, I'm not suggesting that Evola in any way would have embraced Islam or anything like that. He said he disliked that form of, especially ritualists, the five prayers, ablutions. He would have had nothing to do with that. But certainly there is a correspondence between his ideas and Guénon's idea, from a world of quality to a world of quantity, our world, where quality is being dismissed. So there are similarities. One person whom I did not mention was Alistair Crowley, famous English Satanist. Great character. He made it to the jacket of the Beatles LP, didn't he? Now, again, I talk about this in my book, because I try to use the book which I'm writing at the moment, and try to use Crowley as a kind of how shall I say, something to fight something else. But Evola sent me to England poor young Francesco, to Cefalù, which is a place in Sicily where Crowley was based. Sometime when Crowley was there, about always in 1911, like that. Now the house where Crowley lived still exists. It's dilapidated, but still exists. At some stage you could buy it, apparently, if you wanted to buy it. And we went to visit the place, but that wasn't Crowley's house. That was a strange man who opened the door and everything else. And there were strange female figures prancing about in the background. And then Francesco disappeared for a while. So then turned up again, apparently had experienced it. Anyway, the whole thing, I was very banal, very, very peculiar, but there was some sort of Crowleyan. He was also a painter, incidentally. I do regret that there was in London about 10 years ago an exhibition of Crowley's paintings. I wanted to buy some, but I didn't.
Just to clarify Richard's question, he didn't feel an obligation to have an heir. He didn't feel that was a traditional duty of him to fulfill.
No, he disliked, well, first of all, he wasn't, he didn't believe in monogamy. He believed in multiple, but no, he would have regarded that as a bourgeois thing.
Yeah.
The myth of the little angel, the little cherub. You can't imagine Evola sort of cuddling his little child.
Joel, I think you had another question, did you think?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it veers off the track of Evola, but I'm just kind of curious because you're an interesting person yourself. I'm curious as to how an Italian becomes an Anglican priest.
I was ready with that question. Thank you for
obviously
asking.
A plant in the.
I was often asked. Well, in a way, I mean, there's no direct rational answer. I would say it belongs to an existential path. When I was young, I really thought of becoming a Jesuit. But it was only a, how should I say, it was an ideal, not a vocation. I read the life of St. Ignazio of Loyola, which always regarded as a fascinating character. Absolutely, I love St. Ignatius. But as a personality, I can't imagine anyone more remote from me, because I'm not that kind of terrible fire attack. I spent a few days in a retreat thinking about it, which I went to see the provincial superior of the Society of Jesus in Rome, Padre Julius Cesare Federici. If your name is Julius Cesare in Italy, you've got to be of aristocratic origin. You don't get a name like Julius Cesare, you're a plebeian. And he sent me to this retreat in a few days. I came out as bored stiff. I felt, this ain't for me. But I always retain an inclination towards the transcendent. When I was, I don't know if you want to know everything, but I mean, when I was in London, I did postgraduate work at King's College London. I spent a year in a place called King's College Hostel in Beaton Square. At the time, King's College had still had a department for, let's call it a theological college, for training ordinand to a priesthood. But he was closing, and I spent a year in that place, King's College Hostel, and made friends with some of the boys, which are early boys and the women, and it kind of rubbed off on me. But it was not a rejection of Catholicism. He didn't say, oh, I got to become an Anglican. And actually, I belong to the Anglo-Catholic version of Anglicanism, which is more bells and bells than Catholicism was completely discarded the ritualism. But Anglicanism, in some small fringe, still retains. You can still play the magic trick. Anyway, so that's it in a nutshell. And then, I mean, about quite a few years ago, I got really pissed off, forgive my language, with the Church of England, so damn liberal and wishy-washy. I took early retirement, but I continued my ministry in eccentric ways.
And this is an example of it. Thank you. Well, we're very pleased with that. Does anyone on art? That's Tom. The first hand I saw. Tom, please unmute and unleash.
Thank you, Stead. Hello, Father Gelli. I'd like to ask about the popular myth about Evola that he engaged with in some kind of sexual rituals with a Russian witch in the catacombs of Rome, allegedly.
Well, I mean, it is the first time I heard about this. Would it not be mentioned by any chance in that idiotic book by a French woman, whose ethnicity I will not mention, be careful here, who wrote a book, Hey Lucifer, which is a serial interpretation of Evola as a Luciferian figure. Is it, by any chance, does it come from that book?
I have not read that book. It could perhaps come from that. I've seen this rumor circulating on the internet for many years. Apparently, it was a woman who was older than he was, a Russian woman, some kind of esotericist, and this is perhaps who he practiced tantric things with. But I wasn't able to find out what the source on it was. I thought perhaps you would enlighten me.
No, I am afraid that it is the first time I hear this. I should mention as well, there's somebody else, a serious Italian writer called Sibilla Averano. She wrote a book entitled I Love, Therefore I Am, in which is about some various characters, but there is one character with a pen name who is based on Evola. She does say, the magician is so sinister and everything else. But that's more of a literary exercise. She doesn't go further, but she was a serious writer, Sibilla Averano.
Okay. In the room, anyone with any questions? If not, I'll go to the people online. I think it's one hand. Anyone here? Cornelius, Ryan, or any? Okay. The only hand I can see is Mayor Ryan. I can't read the writing in chat because it means that it's got to come up on the screen, which I want to keep Father Frank on view. Mehran, yeah, please have your question.
Thank you for a great presentation. My name is Mehran Oghaboy. I'm from Sweden, Iranian background. I have two questions. One is more general and one is more specific. One is how can tradition and traditionalism offer path or, views of for future? Can you see any? I mean, how far can you go back to tradition? When do you become traditional? This is one question. And my second one is, relating to two topics very connected, related to each other. One is the Ismailian, so-called assassin tradition of Hassan Sabbah, and that tradition of opposing Islam, traditional Islam, the tradition of resisting the Caliphate and the Turks, Seljuk Turks, as recognized tradition within Islam, which is anti-Islam in many ways, because it was very pro-Iranian, Shia, and some say extreme in many ways, and at the same time aspirating for conquering Egypt and connecting to the Fatimid caliphates, which were also Iranian and Shiites. And then I want to connect this with the traditional Vikings, because when I visited a friend in Iran, Tehran recently, he told me about only two mysterious traditions left, which were, contemporary, which was Ismailian and Fatimids and the traditional Vikings for 1,000 years ago. And he told me that the only reason they survived was their mystery, not cults, but mystery religions, and fearless ones, and very contemporary. And by that, I want to ask you about, how can, for example, the tradition we are living in include the tradition of Ismailites and Vikings into their so-called mainstream way of thinking, their traditions, give it the recognition they deserve.
Right,
Maybe as
thank
a
you very much.
future. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I mean, first the question of importance of tradition. Once again, that's just reiterating what I said. It's just a framework of ideas, concepts, and texts which can be useful in counteracting the pestilent tendencies of our age, the age of dissolution. Second point of Ismail is actually I never come across a connection with the Vikings. But certainly, actually, it's interesting that Evola connected the Ismailis with the Knights Templars. The Knights Templars also, according to him, were initiatic. The destruction of the Knights Templars in Europe was one of the most sinister, darkest episodes of European history. They exterminated Philip the Fair, King of France, and that was almost a kind of, an anticipation of the French Revolution, with a kind of initiatic chivalrous order which was butchered by this ghastly secular ruler. But it's interesting. I mean, many of my Muslim contacts are actually Shia. I got a lot of Shia friends. I've been to Iran for conferences twice, and I've hugged Mahmoud Ahmadinejad when he was president of Iran. I felt his hair in my face. I remember feeling it. And so I liked the Shia a lot. The Ismailis, you say enemies of Islam, I think certainly at some stage they believed that the Yom al-Qiyamah, the day of resurrection, had come. So they abolished the fortress of Alamut, wasn't it? They declared that the day of the resurrection had arrived. So they abolished all the prayers, they abolished Ramadan, they abolished the fast, and decided that this was a time of absolute freedom. But of course they had to go back to that because there was much of a muchness which came after the day of resurrection. Nothing much changed. But I think I quite like the idea of Ismailis, a esoterical tradition, again linked with the Knights Templar. There's actually a book by, I think, a Frenchman making the connection between the Grail and Islam being a root. I don't remember the title of the book. It's a quite interesting book. So there are many connections. I think, but I'm not dismissive. I don't think Ismailis were anti-Islam, although they were because of esoterical interpretation at some stage. But they were a fascinating brigade.
All right, thank you. I'm going to ask a question in the room. Do you think that he would have been genuinely happy if he had been born in, the age of Ovid and was able to follow Roman pagan tradition quite naturally?
Well, it's interesting, the age of Ovid.
Or,
already under Augustus, and that was really declined.
Well, the age depicted in the writings of Ovid, such as the Fasti, where that describe Roman paganism in a very vivid and colourful way. Well, choose your period of Roman paganism.
Okay,
do you think that would have?
It certainly, unless it had been into the golden age of Roman history, I don't think he would have liked to have been under.
Just to follow, why didn't he become a a pagan following that tradition coming from?
Well, in a way, I think if you want to call him a pagan, yes, you call him a pagan. In that sense, he was appreciative of this, and not that they didn't believe you could revive the ancient gods or anything like that. But these transcendent values, these spiritual energies which you could get plugged into by being initiated into a particular.
He didn't have an altar in his home for private worship, devotion.
I don't remember such a place.
No. Sorry, I was monopolising that. I think. Yes, and then we'll go back. Yeah. Please go ahead.
I'm no expert on the work of Evola, but the impression I got from what I have read, and and also similar in the work of Genon, is there seems to be an equation of capital P traditionalism with kind of Platonism or Neo-Platonist metaphysics in many cases. I mean, in the Metaphysics of Sex, he deals to Platonic metaphysical conceptions extensively. And as you were just describing, he appreciated, in a sense, the form of many traditions, but not the content of anything in particular. And so this strikes me as, he kind of preaches this notion of decline, but in the same sense, his philosophy of what tradition is, according to these very terms, is quite modern, in the sense that the revolution in ancient Greece, the metaphysical kind of production, particularly Platonic philosophy, was a kind of rejection. Like Socrates was a kind of revolutionary of his time. There was a rejection of the Homeric era, pagan philosophy of more like pre-Hellenic Greece, so in a sense, he is part of a break from tradition in many of his ideas, and so to me this is quite interesting because there seems to be, in a certain sense, a certain argument, like if you're a kind of a neo-pagan of some sort, that in a way like these ideas are actually corrosive to your attempt at kind of reconstruction of your tradition. And also he was also hostile to Christianity, which is another living tradition that he was, as an Italian, grew up around. So it seems interesting to me that there seems to be a hostility in Evola to actual traditions that are actually, in terms of their practice, and instead an appreciation of, obviously he is a perennialist, so he has an appreciation of the form, but in a certain sense, is this not corrosive to the very notion of tradition?
Well, it does talk of traditions in the plural. So there are some traditions, the capital with a small t, which you regarded as negative. But it's actually interesting you mentioned Plato. Now, in Plato's Republic, there is a hierarchical, it's a utopia, of course, it's a hierarchical description of a society. It's that justice in action, but justice not in the modern sense, in a sense of everybody is given what belongs to him. Unique sum, they used to have this Latin motto someplace. And you talk about the forms. Now, of course, in modern philosophy, the philosophy, Anglo-Saxon analytical philosophy, which is what you study if you study in English university, the idea of the forms is not taken literally. They were not acting causally. They were not like in Plato. The form of a bed actually causes the empirical beds, but they are merely prototypes. They're really, if you like Jung's archetypes. So they're not sort of seen a living entity which generates anything empirical. But coming back to the question of you mentioned Neoplatonism. It's interesting. There's a lot of interest in Plotinus. I reference Plotinus someplace in Evola, but of course Plotinus, the people who made much of Plotinus, or St. Augustine, and some Christian writers, because of his threefold principle, as a foreshadowing of the Trinity. Now, that is not something which everyone wanted to have anything to do with. There's aspects of the personality of Plotinus described by Porphyry, his life of Plotinus, which would be interesting, but I don't think it's sort of, in terms of, you mentioned Catholicism, as I already described, you consider Christianity as, in the most negative terms. It's not a tradition. Even Roman Catholicism, they had no great sympathy for. In fact, after Vatican II, completely dismissed it. So that would be an example of a tradition he would have nothing to do with, nor indeed he would have anything to do with traditional democracy or search for free thinking in the rationalistic sense. It's sort of related to entirely different categories. Transcendence, energies from above, all that is exemplified in the myths, in the legends, I think is it you who mentioned Hesiod or Homer a moment ago? You mentioned Homer? You
I mentioned Homer, Greece.
Yes, Greece. Well, I mean, in Homer, he would have liked the warrior element, because again, he considered himself a kshatriya, a warrior. So we would regard him already in Homer, there is a kind of as a discussion of Homer is almost impossible, but I mean, take Odysseus. Odysseus hankers after his beloved family, his home. Evola didn't care about it, going back to home, to a son or to a wife. So if you like, that already foreshadowing a kind of bourgeois attitude towards life, which he would not, he would have liked the Odysseus, the warrior, not so much as the cunning deceiver, but the warrior, the fighter.
How is this bourgeois? Because I mean, the kinship relations of you know of antiquity and prior between like formed clans and formed aristocracy is embedded in like.
Yeah, well, in that sense, yes, I agree. But I'm afraid he was writing and living in Italy of the previous century, where the family was, especially Mussolini, who made much of the family, as he needed an increase in population to man his colonies and empire and so on. And actually in Italy there was a tax. If you were unmarried and you didn't have any children, you paid an extra tax on celibacy. And you were regarding that as relating to a proletarian spirit. Proletarian really, root meaning is prolus, having lots of kids. So in that sense, they were regarded as negative, degenerate. But in the sense in which you mentioned, as kinship and the importance of a sacred relationship, you know, I mean, Roman family, you had the gods, the household gods, Lares and Penatus, by the fireplace, didn't you? So in that sense, he would have appreciated that. Yes.
Yeah, it's a very complex relation. I'm just going to quickly make a remark online. I'm going to be asking the two Michaels in London and Cologne for a comment, because you normally have something interesting to say. But if you don't, when I come to you, just pass on it. Please. Please.
Hi, my name's Tom. I was going to ask you, you said that Julius Evola was extremely hostile to Christianity. I was wondering whether he had any thoughts on Gnosticism, which might appeal to his interest in esotericism and hidden knowledge a bit more.
Yes, I can't pinpoint anyone in particular, but yes, I think, Gnosticism is a very large bag of tricks, isn't it? There are different kinds of Gnostics, but even Christian Gnostics. And Clement of Alexandria, for example, does interpretation of Christianity is really Gnostic, as you know, at the end of the day means knowledge, a sacred knowledge. So in that sense, but yes, and actually, that's a tension which Alain de Benoist refers to in a short essay somewhere. And he says in Evola there is a tension between a man of knowledge, if you like, the Gnostic, and a man of action, the kshatriya or the warrior. And there is a tension there, which is never, what he says, never reconciled. I don't see your point. I mean, if you are paralyzed on the waist down, there's not much action, because hardly engaged. But it was actually after World War II, he was indicted and tried with some young men of the far right for trying to bring back the fascist party. So in that sense, he suffered it. And he was in prison for a short while, in a prison in Rome. The main Rome prison, not certainly in my day, and in his day, it was called Regina Coeli, which I found it means Queen of Heaven. So he spent some time. So he did do his, he did engage. But then after his injury, all he was limiting what he could do. So I forgot now your food question.
Well, it's about Gnosticism, about whether he found that an acceptable form of...
Sorry, that I must plead ignorance. He does talk a great deal about, in his book, Mask and Face of Modern Spiritualism or Spirituality, in which he refers discussing theosophy and anthroposophy. Certainly, Jung called anthroposophy a modern Gnostic sect. Therefore, an example of modern Gnosticism, which I can see the point of that. But he was very negative towards both. He didn't care about them at all.
Michael in London, do you have any comment or question?
Not fully. It was because of the sound. I was really not able to follow the talk, so that I could actually have many questions. But I did read Gelli's book and enjoyed it very much, and I can understand how you, as a young person, were impressed by the man. I'm only wondering now, do you have any criticisms of him and his? I know you said that he liked to pull people's legs, and so a lot of what he said was more for the effect than the accuracy of what he was actually saying. But even with all that, are you at all critical of the man at this point?
Well, I mean, my criticism in a way is expressed in the thesis of the book, that he was a Malamatia. He followed the way of shame. So in a way, he made amends, atoned for some of his views, for example, about the Jews, race and so on, by they were part of this deliberate policy of seeking shame in order to...
So he felt ashamed of something?
No, he didn't feel ashamed. That is the thesis of my book, which is somewhat extreme. So in that sense, what I'm saying, from a point of view of my book, by embracing some of his extreme ideas, he expressed his shame. Well, I'm using a word in the Malamatia sense. That is my thesis. In reality, well, in my book, I do talk about hints which he gave, which were sort of more subtle. And there is no point trying to make Evola into a modern, progressive, enlightened guy who is fond of some minorities of some of the progressive left-wing causes of our time. There is no point. It's all
yeah, a difficult thing to do. So no real criticism. I mean, you just leave him as he is.
I thought he was great.
As a force of nature. Okay. I hope that's been some answer. I'm going to ask Michael in Cologne if. Hello, Michael.
Yeah. Hello there, Steve. Yeah, I'm sorry
great.
You didn't see. I was so pleased with myself that I mastered the technology.
I'm sorry,
the yellow hand.
You have a yellow curtain, so I could.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Father. Very stimulating. I suppose I have the Gretchen Frage, the Gretchen question, which has to occur for me, at least, in all these discussions. Did Evola, do people like Evola believe in a divinity at all? Because sometimes I have the cynical, perhaps, impression that they might see certain religions or traditions as tools in which to enforce or to promote a certain kind of politics. But is there a genuine belief in a divinity, in this case on Evola's part? And if not, for what reason would one wish to enshrine tradition with a quasi-religious value if one doesn't believe in God?
Good question.
Well, I mean, actually, Michael, I know Michael from the Soteria, the other group which our friends is involved in, so I know Michael quite well. Well, thanks, Michael, for the question. I mean, again, maybe there is an ambiguity of the word religion here. Words like religion, the sacred, we tend to interpret them in our culture by reference to monotheism. But of course, there are traditions like Hinduism where there is no monotheism, no private gods, although some say behind all the various pantheon of gods in Hinduism there is the Nirguna, Brahman, or Saguna, who is beyond that sophisticated. But no, Evola did not believe in that. We don't think it was necessary to postulate. And incidentally, Evola also did not particularly believe in reincarnation. We thought the idea of reincarnation had too much of consolatory element, consoling element, you like to think of yourself as living on. But also, I think one thing he said, there's so many people who are not worth getting reincarnated. So many people who should not get reincarnated.
They would be reincarnated as lower beings, maybe even as
Well,
stones.
well,
That's the orthodox.
yeah, but I mean, that's so kind of, no, Michael, I mean, if you're looking for someone who can lead you to a belief in a divine being, Evola is not a guy to look at.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Krista, please.
It's a softer question, really, because we want to know you as well.
Flattered. Flattered.
But it must have been absolutely wonderful to go into a writing process and to remember, and to then put those, memories into words. And I would like to know what triggered that. Was it the smell of the coffee that you had together? Was it the words that you hear in your ear? Because you said you made no notes, but obviously a lot stayed with you in your being. How did that come to you? What visualization did you use to have that?
Well, the simple answer is I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I can't remember what led me to decide to write this book about Julius Evola. Maybe desire to try to put a different interpretation, and I had many memories. And I went to Rome once, and I met up with one of my old mates from the Solstizio group, who later on joined the Carabinieri and became a general of the Carabinieri, and was actually in charge of counter-espionage. So he made quite a career. And he told me quite a few stories about some of the conspiracies, some of the events which happened in Italy, especially in the 70s and 80s, involved in the Secret Service, living by the side. Sorry, I can't really remember. But the first book which I wrote online was actually based on my experiences in Turkey when I was a chaplain there. And I got to know lots of Muslims and how one can relate to a prophet of Islam. It's entitled A Prophet and a Priest. But that was quite easy to write because I remembered a lot of that. Taking notes and so on. The thing about Evola was more difficult because, again, it's much further back. But I can't really give you sometimes, something sparks off, but you can't call it inspiration, but you can rationalize inspiration. Sorry, Tom, what you asked?
So my question was, I'm a bit confused about some of Evola's reasoning when it comes to being completely against Christianity for the ostensibly pacifistic values, but then embracing Buddhism, which, from my understanding of the teachings of Buddhism, tends to also be against self, anger, asserting your will over others. The same sorts of values, but even more extreme than Christianity. So I was wondering why he embraced Buddhism so much, but rejected Christianity.
Well, of course, he did not embrace Buddhism. He wrote about it.
Okay.
He did not sort of attach himself to Buddhism. It was just, but again, it's the notion of awakening. The Buddha is the awakened one. The Dasakatama is the awakened, waking up from some sort of illusions. Similarly, well, Christianity once, he really didn't like Christianity at all, because he didn't feel drawn to the Jesus of the Gospel, or the idea of St. Paul, the idea of international fraternity, brotherhood, appeal to the slaves, the disinherited, the masses. It's initially Christianity was a religion for the masses. I don't think it was someone who said that Christianity was Bolshevism for the masses. It was actually Nietzsche who said that. But I think it's not quite correct, because we know that in the early Christianity, many of the aristocratic posh Roman ladies embraced Christianity. They would not have done it if they felt it had been a religion only for slaves. So it's a more complicated story than that.
If I could say something very briefly about Buddhism, there's a sense in which it's quite useful to see it as part of Hinduism, because the Buddha is one of the, I think it's the 9th avatar of Lord Vishnu, And Hinduism is definitely not a religion, although it's got the image of being very peaceful. The Bhagavad Gita takes place on a battlefield, and there were lots of examples of violent action, which is necessary because it's dharma, because it's, you know. So I think he could find that in Buddhism as well. I think that if
there's also another interpretation of Buddhism, like Pol Pot, for example, was a Buddhist.
yeah.
And his rationalization was, well, you know, it's, who cares? You know? Like it's a liberatory,
that's not serious.
Kind of post-moral kind of component to Buddhism.
But the only form of Buddhism, or which I've had some personal experience, is Zen. I did flirt with Zen for a while. I even spent a few months in a Zen monastery in Alsace, a part of France called Alsace. There was, because in Rome, again, I'm always flirting with things. I got to know an Italian guy who had converted to Zen Buddhism, and he had his own dojo, shrine, whatever, in Italy. But I mean, he followed a particular Zen master called the Shimado Roshi, who is someone who's written quite a few books, actually. And Roshi, the Shimado, ran a dojo, a community in Alsace. And I went there, I was there for 1 or 2 months. I did Zen meditation, so on. I'm not claiming to have, I mean, part of me, meditation is very tricky. I've got mixed feelings about it. But anyway, Zen Buddhism is a very sort of peculiar kind of Buddhism. Some forms they reject rituals, and but Zazen is very structured, very, if you like, formulaic, so it's not anarchical in any way. Although some claims, you know, have you ever read Alan Watts? Alan Watts was an Englishman who wrote a lot. He was, in a way, a mess. Drank a lot. But he wrote some interesting stuff about Zen. I even set up an Alan Watts Society at some stage.
Oh.
One of my fellow clergy, who was an evangelical Christian, said, "Frank, you're disgusting. You ought to resign your old."
Ryan, please.
What practical advice do you think Evola would give to right-wingers in the present day? In terms of there don't appear to be any aristocrats around, or true aristocrats. Become a warrior, you have to fight for liberal democracy. So what are we to do in a practical sense?
Well, I'd like to touch on that question earlier on, in that what he would say, I'm not opportunity to say, but I mean, his message can be found in books like Men in the Ruins, in Riding the Tiger, and so on, which is in a way, you know, and also his idea of fighting, you know, fighting war is supposed to be for an aim, and it's a Thomas Aquinas that says war for its own sake will be stupid. Now that is a statement from a great rationalist thinker, but Evola would not agree with that. He said fighting, the warrior fights because he has to fight. The warrior has to fight. And so in a way, I could say, one has to oppose the present Moloch of liberalism, of democracy, egalitarianism, and many other isms in different ways. One is like refusing to conform, which is dangerous, and to be an inner freedom. But there is no practical, I don't think that you could say, you know, join, there's nothing to join later.
Oh, let's not go.
There is this group.
We'll try and keep it away from making too difficult.
Too nails.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you a very simple question, and I'm going to ask Jeremy at the back, who is a hereditary aristocrat, for a comment or view. I think it's good to get a few different opinions. I just want to ask one small thing. I'd like to imagine Julius Evola happy. Did he? What ordinary things of daily life did he find pleasure in? Did he enjoy classical music? Did he enjoy food?
Food, yes.
He was.
Yeah, he did enjoy a good place.
What did he have for breakfast? That's what we want.
Well, I don't remember because I wasn't there in the early morning. I think Italians would have an espresso. He wouldn't necessarily have a breakfast in the English sense. But he did enjoy a good plate of spaghetti. Yeah?
He enjoyed a good cup of coffee.
Espresso. Yeah.
Oh, well, that's good. That's good.
Yeah.
Jeremy, please, any thoughts? No.
Stand up, so at least I can see you.
I've spent most
No,
of
so
my,
I can see you.
I've been spent most of my life apologising for being an aristocrat. I've been beaten up several times at various schools because I was different. My reason for being here was because when I boned up on Evola quite a long time ago, I discovered he was a geneticist and he was interested in alchemy. Now I collect late 16th, early 17th century alchemy textbooks, and I'm well known for this. My father was an expert on books. What I'm curious about is he doesn't really seem to be very hermetic. I came across some papers which were supposed to be related to Evola. This was somebody I'd never heard of in the 70s about spagyric alchemy, which of course is a very specific type of alchemy, and I think he was being a bit negative. Listening to you talking, he sounds to me a bit like the way Alistair Crowley was perceived. He seems to be sort of like shocking people, which reach the age where I just laugh when people try to shock me, not because I'm unshockable, but really because it seems a bit pointless. It's fun on a social level. I think he had a lot of social pretensions, didn't he?
Social
pretensions.
Pretension.
Yes. And as a personal thing, and as somebody who also trained as a priest and lost my faith, I would like to know the 6 articles of faith that you reject if you can be an Anglican priest. Because you're allowed to reject 6 of them. Any 6 will do, but I'm just curious. And do you wear a cassock with 36 or 39 buttons?
Good question. I think I got 39 buttons, so I don't wear a cassock very often these days.
Right, okay. By the way, I was a personal friend of Canon Jones many years ago. That means everything to you.
Canon Jones, I'm afraid.
Cheslin Jones, librarian at Pusey House, later Pusey.
Oh, Pusey House, well, I know Pusey House, but I'm afraid.
Yeah, well, I was brought up very Anglo, very, very high church, but not Catholic.
I understand.
My family are Culdies. We come from North East Scotland.
Right.
And we are notoriously opposed to any form of papacy.
Yes, well, first of all, a point about aristocracy. As I mentioned before, Men of the Ruins, one of his books, a breviary of what to do in an age of dissolution. The preface is by Prince Valerio Borghese. He was a member of the Roman aristocracy. His mother was German, in fact, and he was a warrior who served in the maritime commanders. And actually in Men of the Ruins, actually one of his recipes for some kind of fight back is finding leaders among the members of nobilities, aristocratic families, as well as among the young people disaffected because of what happened during the Second World War. So in a way, there was a cultivating, of aristocracy. But I always remember thinking, well, there is a tension between aristocracy of blood and aristocracy of character, which is the one which he really meant. I think, if we see now Prince Andrew,
well, yes, they're very bourgeois royal family. I've got more royal blood in my veins than they have.
I don't want to say anything.
Yeah, that's.
I mean, I'm related to every single royal house in Europe that has ever reigned, from either side of the blanket, for the last 2,000 years.
And we're very pleased that you've deigned to come to our meeting, Jeremy. So thank you.
Anyway, it's all right.
Go on.
I was going to say, yes. Evola, it seems to me he likes shocking people, and there are philosophers that I've come across because of my clinical studies who, this way of shame, I sometimes wonder whether we should call it the way of shame. It's more a way of shock.
Well, that's my interpretation.
I think we've covered that point. Yeah.
There are various paths in various religious theologies, aren't there? And it seems to me that it's a jolt. It's something to jolt your consciousness into a link with your own consciousness. But that's, you know, that's a talk for another time.
Oh, it's interesting. When you mention alchemy, he wrote about alchemy actually.
He did, yes, that's right.
Now, I must admit, that's my weak point, because alchemy really interested me. I read Jungian alchemy, but it wasn't really something I would...
Jung is a psychoanalyst or whatever, and not an alchemist. I mean, a lot of people say he is alchemical symbols and so on. But I mean, I go back to the original alchemists and the Rosicrucians. What was his attitude to the Rosicrucians? Did he just... I mean, they were pretty anti-Catholic.
Well, I'm sure you know Rosicrucians, which emerged at, was it Darmstadt, someplace in Germany? They were very violently anti-Catholic, and the argument they usurped the title of Knights of the Rosy Cross. There is one Masonic title which refers to the Rosy Cross.
No, I'm not talking about the Freemasonic influence.
No, I'm just mentioning it as such. I say certainly from what we know, the influence of Rosicrucians. There are people today who call themselves Rosicrucians.
I know, the Abel.
I think they're just joking, a joke. They're not really Rosicrucians. But I mean, I think it's a Rosy Cross. But yes, it's violently anti-Catholic, anti-tradition, in that sense of Rosicrucian. But I mentioned Freemasonry because he makes a distinction in his writings between Scottish Rite Freemasonry, which according to him retain elements of esoteric elements, a reference to the Knights Templars and so on, and Grand Orient Freemasonry, which was very strong in Italy, which was outlawed by Mussolini, which was very left-wing and progressive oriented.
Oh, right. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, what did you say? I missed that.
It's often referred to by Masonic historians as pharaonic because it uses a lot of Egyptian 18th century ideas of Egyptian gods and goddesses.
So, thanks, Jim. I'd like to. I think we should be thinking about moving the meeting to an end soon. And so I'd like to ask if anyone has got any final questions. I think and there's a gentleman, Stefan. Oh, Stefan. Sorry, I didn't recognise you wearing your hat. Yeah, please unmute. Good night. Good to see you.
Wonderful moustache.
Yes. I think nothing has been said about the other dimension of Islam, especially today, and its connotation with the Arab and Near Eastern invasion into Europe. And because this is going to be transmitted through YouTube, I think I'd like to ask you if you could elaborate on the several strains inside Islam, and because Islam has several strains, of course, and there are some strains coming from the Iranian tradition, Zoroastrianism and so on, and this is Julius Evola has always recognized, given a direction, a compass toward the Aryan and even the Hyperborean element, and he recognized that element also in that strain of Islam. This is my understanding of that. What would you say on that?
You say Aryan?
I think Stefan was asking about the fact that Islam is an increasing element, coming into Europe. So there's and also whether there was an Aryan element that he might make.
Yeah, and I think also Sufis and that esoteric direction of a dimension of Islam is stemming from the Aryan element, Aryan strain in Islam, the Zoroastrian. She wrote something about that also when writing about Mithric mysteries.
Of course, Iran is the land of the Aryans, isn't it?
Yeah.
Iranians are Aryans, that's the meaning of a word. Although in Iran, there are different components of the Iranian nation. There are Turks, there are...
Well, they are not properly Iranian. Turks.
But Islam coming to Europe, well, that's a phenomenon which is in the days of Evola, there was no migration in substantial terms from the East, so from anywhere else, so it was a different world. That is an issue which one has to face.
It's a big issue, which is, you said it wasn't something that was apparent really when...
Well, I mean, there was no minorities in Italy of the 60s, early 70s. I think the first foreign presence, which I remember in Rome when I used to come back at Christmas to see my family, was Filipinos. Lots of Filipino ladies come in to work as maids and servants, because there are lots of Filipinos. But then other groups as well.
I was listening to a lecture by Professor Thomas Sheehan at Stanford the other day, and he said that in I think Britain, there was only about 6% of people who very regularly practiced their religion, and of that, the majority were Muslims. And if that's true, it is a significant factor for the future, isn't it? But of course, that's another.
Well, yes.
Another issue.
But also, you've got to remember that some of these Muslim minorities come from cultures which are, if you like, more conservative, more traditional.
Yeah. And that would attract a lot of people
which have not had, I don't know, enlightenment or critique or texts. I mean, the Muslims do not accept a critique, a scientific, it's not a critique of the Quran, although, like the Quran is a book which has many, influences. It is not a text which is obviously, which you cannot describe from a critical point of view directly from one source. But they don't accept it. It's not allowed, so you can't do it. Whereas here in Europe we got critiques, scientific critiques of gospel.
I must say that there are other traditional paths available. Islam, I don't think one should. There is the various Northern European paths which can be practiced in whichever.
What's the Northern European path?
One of them that you're speaking at a meeting of, which can be practiced according to however the followers think should be practiced. So the Hinduism and Buddhism are both.
Okay. Islam, how does Islam fit into that?
Well, I'm saying there are other traditional dispensations which people can follow. There are people practicing Roman religion, the Hellenic religion as well, in fairly traditional ways. So one does not need to become a Muslim to live by traditional values.
I'm not suggesting one should.
No,
in any way, no. At all.
On I think, Richard, is that hand up for the first questions, or is it for something new? If it's for something new, please speak. Otherwise, we will, I think, move things to an end. Richard?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I do have something new just to add. We did briefly speak on this before by another speaker, but I just thought that I'd get straight to the point. I wanted to know, Father Gelli, if you could enlighten me as to whether Julius Evola's attitude to Freemasonry, the institution of Freemasonry, both the Grand Orient or the English variant, shifted over time. I believe that René Guénon did belong to a certain Masonic lodge in France at some point, but then either retracted or moved away from it after converting to Islam. That's really my question, and it comes as a result of his efforts. I believe, I don't know whether he was the editor or whether he was the author. There was a collaborative work published called The Occult War in
Yes.
19, I think it was 1918, 1919, 1920. But it was with Emanuel Milinski whose origin I'm not entirely familiar with, but yes, and with Leon de Ponson's as well. So that's my question, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. I mean, so the question was, Genon, yes, he'd been a Mason, was Evola, certainly he knew a lot on Freemasonry. He never said, I was a Mason, which they don't do anyway, no one. But he knew a lot about Freemasonry, which he might have known in other ways. His attitude was that Freemasonry, especially Scottish Rite, incorporated elements from ancient traditions, the reference to the Templars, so on, but it had become corrupted. Certainly thought of Freemasonry was very instrumental in the revolutions which, especially the French Revolution, which undermined the traditional order. And if you know anything about Italian history, very Risorgimento, all the leaders of Italian Risorgimento, Cavour, Garibaldi, Mazzini, the King Victor Emmanuel, they're all Masons. They belong to different lodges, of course, but I mean, some lodges were more radical, but they were all Masons because that was the thing to do, and in almost a fashion. But he did not approve of that, insofar as Freemasonry was a bearer of plots and theories which are very profound. And it's also, it's based on a universalistic view, which Evola would not have shared. It was actually, to be fair to the Church of England, it was a very good report produced on the Freemasonry on the Church of England back in the 80s. Whether Freemasonry and allegiance to Christianity are compatible. It was written by a very good lay woman, the ex-diocese, Dr. Margaret Hewitt. And I still have the pamphlet, and she concluded, no, you can't. So, I mean, I'm not saying that's what everyone would say, but certainly Freemasonry is very dodgy. In my first parish, St. Nicholas Chiswick, I was offered by someone to be a Mason. And I looked at the guys who were Masons and I said, I really want to be in the company with no farts. I was a bit younger at the time. So I declined, so I don't know, it wasn't so much ideological, but later on I read about it and I think it's not really compatible with Christianity because it's where Yabulon. Who is Yabulon?
I'm going to ask people to do something which is very traditional, which is to make an offering so that these sort of events can take place, to put something called the Hierarchy Room and the YouTube account. So
yes,
we have this nice offertory bag, which I will.
It's like in church.
Yeah, but it's very discreet, so perhaps that you can pass it around. Thank you. Thank you very much. It has. I'll just ask anyone. Is there anyone online who's not spoken, not made a comment? Edith, Linda, Tony, Anthony in Australia, Andre. As we bring the meeting to an end, if anyone's written something in the comments, I'm afraid they're very small, and I'm not able to see them. But if anyone who hasn't spoken, please raise a hand. Otherwise, we'll be moving things to an end. Do you have a thing to say? Good. That's good.
I don't think many people know Italian. You can say anything.
Many thanks. Thank you. Let's covers the room. Now, as is. Well, yeah, sorry. As is the tradition of the Moot, I always ask the guest if he or she would like to end the event with prayer of some words from his own tradition, and I think Father Frank will say something not in English.
Well, first a brief phrase. In English, it's a quotation from the Emerald Table, Tabulas Meridina, Gnostic text. Heaven above, heaven below. In Italian now. Oh, grande anima, di cui abbiamo parlato questa sera, so che il tuo spirito sta lì, c'è intorno, sei qui, stai con noi. Grazie del tuo lavoro, grazie della tua opera. Per favore, illuminaci e guidaci verso un sentiero più illuminato e profondo che ci salvi da questa età oscura. Ti preghiamo.
Blessed God, with our peoples and lands, at the evening one should pray today, and at the night one should pray for the evening. We're thankful for what we've found got pleasure in and what we've found profitable. Sigurd Ido, Sigurd Ido, Sigurd Os, Sigurd Os, Frido Ido, Frido Ido, Frido Os, Frido Os. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Frank, thank everyone for serving. And thanks everyone online for your company.
Thank you for coming.
Much appreciated. Bye bye everyone. Bye bye everyone. Just a very brief announcement. The next Moot, which will be online. Our friend Asker Svat from Siberia. He'll be talking about his new book, Polemos 2. He's very much an intellectual heir of the Evola tradition. Well, anyone's welcome to have a look at this. This will be 13th, Sunday the 13th at 5 p.m. online, because it's very late inside Siberia. So, yeah, please mix and have a chat. Thank you.
Could you show it to us, the book? Would you show us the book?
Yeah, sure. It's a very substantial text, very substantial. Very much recommend it.
Polemos means war in Greece. The title.
And the first book was very good, and this looks excellent. So I hope I see everyone on the 13th of February at 5 p.m. Anthony, how are you? Are you well?
Oh yes, more or less.
Good to see you. Well, I'll close the meeting. I've got to attend to live people, but thanks very much.
Cheerio, thanks.
Bye. Thanks a lot.